He was born in Bangalore, India. He lived in England for 10 years, and he moved to San Diego in 1972, where he founded Action Instruments. So please help me welcome Jim Pinto.
Thank you, Jim. Interesting. With my mixed background, which I hope is going to help me interpret some of the things, I'm going to show you lots of charts and figures and numbers. I remember going to a speech in China once, which was sort of a technology speech. And at the end of the speech, when it came to Q&A, questions and answers, somebody got up and said, "Where are you from?" Kind of my accent was neither Indian or British or American or whatever, and I said, spontaneously, I hadn't thought that would be the technical question. And I said, well, my body was made in India, and my heart was made in England, and my head was made in the United States. And my host got up and said, and your spirit is Chinese. With that mixed background, I want to talk about the global future. Not out there on the ocean, as Petri told us. And with all this technology that's coming that John Smart told us. But of the countries that are already there, and we know, in fact, we heard from Miltsire the change of how deforestation occurs and things change, and it seems that all the empires have changed, and we have China and India rising. Chindia. Think about this. 300 years ago, China and India produced 50% of the wealth in the world. In the world. Like for several hundred years. Then there was 300 years of decline while the Indians were taken over by the British. And then, of course, China went through all kinds of repercussions. And then they both got independence, 1947 for India, 1949, Mao Zedong came and had the great People's Republic. And now, in 50 years it's taken, which is a long time, but not so long, they're emerging to the next world power. Look at the population distribution. Each of those little dots is 100,000 people. Well, you see the east coast of the United States, and of course in the last 50, 100 years it's moved to the west coast. You see Europe fully populated. And then most of the population is around India and China. Focus on that. Chindia. Chindia rising. Look at the population density. Look at the night lights, as really Patrice showed you, bad rules and good rules. Well, whatever rules they've got, look what's happening. It's a good way to look at population density. Hardly anything in North Korea, but we don't see it. And the population relative size, because population matters. And the relative size of the population, if we redrew the map, that's what it would look like. You can hardly see Canada. India and China look huge. Russia has kind of disappeared, and quite a lot in England, France, Germany, they're all 80 million, 100 million. Japan is about 80, 90 million people, and that's there. And that's the warped map. Difficult chart to look at, but we're talking about 100% of the population. And if you look at America around about there, there's zero. And then, of course, America's population grew to about 4.5% it is today of the world. And interestingly enough, America, the land of immigrants, they were all immigrants. They came from Europe, and all the Chinese and the Indians and all came, and a lot of Chinese labor. But what happened was that produced a lot of population with the immigration and a lot of wealth. Europe had really gotten quite a lot of wealth around there. India and China, the population is still something like 30 to 40%. And what happens? Talking about population growth. From 3 billion in 1960 We're up to about 6.8 billion today, growing to 9 billion. And the Census Bureau has a high chart and a low chart. The high chart is 11 billion and the low chart, and who knows what will happen. But that population is growing. And the population density, look at the black areas. The black areas, Russia, Europe, population is declining. It turns out, a secret of population, I want to tell naysayers, you get rich and you don't want to have babies anymore. So population control comes with relative wealth. But if you don't have, and the population declines, what do? Well, it turns out that America is still growing. Russia, Europe, Japan is declining at quite a steady rate. Africa's growing, and India not as fast as, in fact, China and then India is growing the fastest. And in fact, Africa probably the fastest. And that will mean that population-wise, India will overtake China somewhere around 2030 or 2040. As you know, with the autocratic rule in China, you're not allowed to have more than one baby. I asked my Chinese friends, oh, no, we can't. Well, what happens if you have two? Well, long story, and if you have three, you're banished to somewhere. So autocratic government, India tried that, and it didn't work. India is the world's largest democracy, and as we talked about, democracy is messy. It takes time. But look what happened in some of the societies. Really, Japan after the war grew with not so much population, but they grew and they overtook, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the point is, with the population, 1 in 3 people is Indian or Chinese, Chindia. Actually, it's 1 in 2.5, but we don't want to cut anybody in two. 1 in 3. You want to talk about democracy, it's going to be ruled by the Indians and the Chinese if it's purely democratic. But we invented democracy in fairly narrow regions. And if you don't like the rules, then you have your own little democracy. You break off the state from the rest of the country and you can have your own state. But that's a separate story. Look at the ranking of land. Russia is the largest, Canada, the USA. China is number 4. And India is number 8. So let's go back to population, China and India, obviously. European Union, they keep adding countries and so they get more population. It's not a separate country. USA is next, Indonesia, Brazil. Indonesia, we don't think about it much. Pakistan, 275 million people. Number 7, GDP, gross domestic product. How you calculate that? European Union had added Greece, and they're sorry they added Greece. But nevertheless, then there's USA is number 1 for a long time. Japan, number 2. Look how they did it. With a relatively small population, 80 million, after the war, they were decimated and they grew. Must have been good rules. China's next, coming up fast. India is number 12. Wow. The percentage of world GDP, as I mentioned before, if you go back 500 years, 1700 and beyond, India and China owned 50% of the wealth of the world, of the wealth. And by comparison, Europe was savages. And what happened? India and China go very small, but Europe gets quite big. America, from hardly anything, grows and gets to be the number 1 GDP in the world. How does that happen? Look at the GDP growth rates. Well, it turns out the growth rates in Europe and America are small or smallish and declining, with government stimulus plan and whatever else comes up. However, India and China are growing fast, 6, 7, 8% per year. China is estimated something like 10 or 11% in 2010, 2011. And by the way, that's the documented GDP growth. The undocumented, black money and things that circulate that nobody knows. And some of the growth we're talking about is as the wealth gets documented. Interesting switch. The predicted GDP, it turns out that India will overtake Europe, China will overtake the United States, something like 2030 or 2040. My grandson, 8 years old, will be 38 years old when that happens. And what am I going to tell him to do when these things are happening? Will they happen? Well, you tell me. The projected GDP to 2050, most people agree on these numbers. There are three sources of wealth. Think about it. Natural resources. If the Middle East didn't have any oil resources, there would just be little villages in the desert. 700 billion a year goes to the Middle East, the largest transfer of wealth in human history. Oil. After that, there's labor, population related. And then, with the internet age, we're realizing another one, intelligence. Intelligence counts more than population. You know, people thought that farming was 35% of the United States. You know what it's down to? 2%. Why? Combines, tractors. Farmers are being paid to do nothing. Knowledge, intelligence, and innovation counts more than labor. Intelligence. Most of us will recognize right away it's an innate human quality. You can't buy it. You got it, or you don't. The smartest 28%, 25% of China or India is the entire population of the United States. I was in Australia, I was in Canada making the speech. I said the Mensa level 2% of India or China is more than the population of your country. So what's left? There was a TED, Anil Gupta on TED said that the minds on the margin are not marginal minds. Intelligence is innate. Engineering education. Some of this stuff should scare you or excite you. Think about it with the vitality, as it'll be talked about. It's exciting in another way. China will spend the most R&D, research and development. By 2020, they'll overtake the United States. Research and development. Internet usage is growing fast. I'll show you a chart. Engineers per year, China's producing 600,000. India, 350,000. America, 70,000. More than Europe and America combined. Well, you know, a poor education, is that true? Something like 10% of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, startup companies, billionaires, are the Indians and Chinese. Did you know that? Intelligence is innate. Internet users, China has overtaken the United States. The largest education mechanism on the internet is in China today. There's three sources of wealth. And I said three things to do: better, cheaper, faster. And Chindia, unlimited labor pool, they're automating faster than Europe and America. And the low wages and benefits. Interesting point. Somebody said, you do it if you're industrious, you save money, you put your savings away in the post office. Remember when we used to do it in America? Look at the savings rate. It turns out America's savings rate is less than half what they naturally, culturally do in India and China. Inventions 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago, paper, printing, compass, gunpowder, wheelbarrow, the clock invented in China. Indians are spiritual and cerebral, so they say. Architecture, astronomy, cartography, mathematics, Ramachandran was saying, they invented zero in India. Metrology. And the interesting point, that's my contention, is that the Indians are more right-brained and the Chinese are more left-brained. And Chindia puts the two together, complete and effective. It's a contention, I can't prove it, you think about it for yourself. It's an intuitive extension. The world's largest middle class, purchasing power, users of oil, energy, resources, the biggest market for cell phones. You know, India alone has 100,000 cell phones, new cell phones per day. And where do you think Nokia and all these other guys are selling today? India and China. Problems. Of course there are. Social inequality, you got the rich and the poor. Very poor. Poorer than you can imagine. But reducing fast. Natural resources, China has 7% when they have 20% of the population. You know what the Chinese are doing? They're going to Africa, they're going to all the places there's oil and aluminum and the metals and mining, and they're buying them up. Cheap. Corruption. When I went to India, I said, there's garbage everywhere. And garbage breeds garbage. You see garbage, and what are you going to put it in the garbage can? You throw it in the garbage. I thought it was unsolvable, but it's coming. India has the overpopulation problem. China might have the other one. 50 years from now, all the Chinese will be old, the population will have declined, and who's going to take out the garbage? China and India are cooperating. The business flights between the two countries has doubled annually since 2006. The common market talks have started. There's the two dudes getting together. Hey, let's work together. You be the left brain, I'll be the right. Oh yeah, I think that'll work. My contention, therefore, 300 years is not long. India and China will become the center of the world. Remember how we drew America in the middle of the map, and there's England, the Greenwich Mean Line over here, there, and we split Asia up, and we put America in the middle. Well, look what's in the middle now. Surprise, surprise. Empires have a way of growing and declining. The Roman Empire, you can just name them all. 100 years ago, not a long time, the sun never set on the British Empire. Remember that saying? You still remember it. And where is Britain today? In a socialistic mess. I've got a brother that lives there. I don't understand how they survive. I go to Denny's and have breakfast, and it costs $80. 80 bucks in England. I don't know how they do it. So when I invite them out to a restaurant, oh yeah, we'll go. They never go. Hans Rosling, you should watch this. It's a TED speech where he shows moving charts and how they overtake in 2014, and he says, and finally they'll get to where the GDP is greater than the United States in like 2030 or 2040. Watch that, it's a TED video. Here's my points. The next 50 years will bring big changes. Are you ready for it? Is America ready for it? Will we have war over it? That'll slow it down by 5 years. Aging and mature socialistic West is beginning to slow down. No match for the youthful capitalistic East. The average age in China is 25. The average age in India is 25. China is something like 30. What do? Chindia unleashes a new force of technology and the internet. That's the force they'll use, not for us or against us, for themselves. Capitalism. My grandson will be 35, 40 years old when this happens. What's my instructions to him? Go east, young man. Chindia. Thank you very much.